Hello. I decided to split the end of this reading into a third video. So we are looking at Linton Kwesi Johnson's The Great Insurrection, and we were just talking about how the poem creates a kind of a place from which to speak, and it creates a position that is in some ways marginal to the events that it describes or that it explores, because the speaker, by their own admission, wasn't there. But in many other ways, it's also intimately connected with those events, and it makes cause with those events. It has solidarity. It uses the pronoun we, um, as though the poet themselves was participating in these events. And I suggested that while by far the kind of prevailing tone in this poem is one of celebration and pride, there is also an element of gentle, shrewd criticism. And I don't think we're quite there yet, but it's coming. So in this middle section of the poem, the the poet, as this kind of sleuth figure, is wandering around, gathering up information about what happened, piecing things together. And there's an interesting question: why? Maybe FOMO, maybe regret at having not been there. Then again, if everybody else did something really exciting, is that kind of normal behavior to go around and finding out everything you can about it, letting people tell you these kind of highly enjoyable stories? Maybe you might want some other motives as well. And we can imagine a kind of account of these events that takes a very different form, and it's all about scrupulously recording who says what they saw, what they did, comparing, cross-checking different accounts. I don't think this is that kind of investigation, and it doesn't even really. It doesn't want to be either. There's an element of confidentiality here. There's an element of behaving responsibly with potentially incriminating, dangerous information. And there's an element of trying to tell a collective story rather than a fragmented story, rather than lots of potentially contradictory accounts held in tension, to bring a sort of cohesion, and to speak on behalf of a collective. And I think in this central part of the poem, the poet's eye kind of recedes into the background quite a lot. I think the voices that we're hearing are the voices of the rebels, of the people who were there, but they are blended together and they are spoken by the poet. So there's this interestingly layered voice. I think in one sense it is definitely the poet who's speaking all the way through, but I think in this middle section he's kind of taking up the reported speech. He's taking up the things that he's heard, and he's weaving it into what he's saying. And I wonder if there's maybe an even more layered aspect to this. I wonder if the rebels, perhaps at some points in this middle section, are also kind of adopting the voices of others, so that you have maybe three levels of voice, which would be very appropriate for this information garnered from the vine, information that has kind of moved from person to person to person, to capture some of that sense of the layered quality of this knowledge. And let's see if we can reveal that a little bit more. So the poem kind of reiterates, why did this happen? Babylon went too far. And something quite interesting happens to the pronoun we here. So the pronoun we was adopted earlier as part of what I suggested was like a an attempt to kind of stake out a little bit of legitimacy and to assure the audience or parts of the audience like where the speaker's loyalties lie, where with whom do they have solidarity. So this isn't going to be a judgmental poem. This isn't going to be a kind of versified Scarman report. This is a poem that has kind of absolute solidarity with the uprising. The we does kind of do some interesting transformations in this middle bit because it deals with tricky, difficult stuff. And it deals with it, I think, partly through humor and partly through the kind of ambiguity of who is actually speaking. I think the poem deliberately kind of mobilizes that ambiguity. When you adopt somebody else's words as your own, it's always ambiguous the extent to which you are endorsing them, or on the other hand, maybe distancing yourself from them in some way. And I think that's what's going on here. So we had to burn a couple cars. So maybe one or two innocent people got hurt, but so what? So I think there's definitely a kind of humor there. There's a kind of brash humor, and there's, I don't know, what do you think? So one reading of that would be as a really dismissive of innocent people who got hurt. The word innocent is, is quite interesting as well, and we could talk more about that. But I wonder if you think that the speaker and or the people that he has spoken to are really saying, who cares? It's a war. You want to make an omelette, you've got to break some eggs. Sometimes people get hurt. Is it that kind of energy? That's maybe one possible interpretation. I think there's a little bit more than that going on, really. What does it mean to frame these events as war? Is that a kind of craven, hard-hearted dedication to the absolute meaninglessness of human suffering and human life? I think just the opposite, really. I think framing these events as a war is something that the poem takes quite seriously, and it's there in the title, calling it an insurrection. There are lots of different types of war. But one thing that they have in common is that they are opposed to the resolution of conflict through some kind of liberal system of justice in which everybody is equal before the law. So when, for example, two sovereign nation states are in a war, yes, they might be bound by certain international treaties, but everybody kind of knows that there's not going to be there's kind of no one that you can turn to be an impartial arbiter of this conflict and to make sure that all wrongs are redressed in a kind of inappropriate way according to some set of laws to which all the parties consent. It's not that kind of situation. And nor is it that kind of situation when you're talking about the conflict between African Caribbeans in Brixton in 1981 and the police. Because what are you going to do when the police stop and search 1,000 people in a few days? Are you going to report them to the police? So I think that by framing it as a war, I think this poem is not is not trying to simplify things. is not trying to be dismissive and saying, well, what happens in a war doesn't matter. The suffering that happens in a war doesn't matter. The damage that's done in a war doesn't matter. But what it is trying to do is place these events into a different philosophical and ethical framework. And to say, war is messy and complicated, and so are these events, and we should be thinking about it in that way. And nobody got hurt. Come on, that's part of this here, right? So, so right after, we get this little section that says, we burnt down the George, the pub, this pub with a long racist history, and we could have burnt the landlord. So I find that one of the most kind of interesting points in this poem. Who is saying we could have burnt the landlord? And in what way are they saying it? How do they feel about that? What do you think? So nobody got killed. Stop making a fuss. Somebody could have got killed. This is the bit where that possibility is being raised. Somebody could have died. And it's being raised in a very particular way. Now, I don't know if I don't know who we certainly can't tell from this poem who the landlord is. We can maybe assume that the kind of racist reputation of the George is, large and powerful enough to inform the reading of this poem, in at least in the initial kind of context in which it would have been received. So on that basis, assuming that that we know that the George is a pub that has been kind of front line of conflict of racist discrimination and anti-racist activism, here's this possibility. What if this person happened to die? Well, I don't know who's speaking. It could be the rebels. It could be, but it could be the rebels adopting the speech of their own critics. In other words, it could be somebody saying, people are saying that we could have burnt the landlord. We didn't burn the landlord. We burnt down the pub. We never burnt the landlord. So I think that's one possible reading, and I think maybe that reading coexists in this poem with another one, which is just raising the possibility. We could have burnt down the landlord. We could have taken this further. We never did, but we could have, and that possibility kind of floats there. And yeah, and I'm not sure at this stage what I think about it. I wonder what you think about it. It certainly seems to be entangled with the possibility of a kind of chilling criticism of these events, that says, if you can't have an uprising in a fashion where absolutely nobody gets hurt, then you have no right to an uprising in the first place. And that kind of discourse, that kind of chilling, suppressive discourse, I think, is something that this poem is trying to counteract, partly by framing these events as part of a war, a kind of war where things do happen accidentally, and that in itself can't possibly be enough to deny people the right of self-defense, or the other factors contributing to a just cause for a war. So that's something, for you as a reader of this poem to judge, to think about through this poem, perhaps. it is very weird doing this, just sitting here with nobody talking back to me. So here's the end of the poem. And I think one of the things that happens in this middle bit is that these difficult questions are being raised in a way that give the speaker a certain amount of kind of deniability and distance from some of the questions that are being raised about the appropriate use of violence, and whether or not this really is a war, and in what sense it might be a war, and in what sense the ethics of war are an appropriate way to think about what's going on. The speaker has some distance from that because this is reported speech. This is the stories that he has gathered. This is what he's heard on the grapevine. And the speaker continues to use these other voices to kind of weave them together. But I feel like, I don't know if you agree, in the last part of the poem, it does feel like the speaker is weaving them together with greater purpose, and really making their own voice kind of rise to the forefront again. And that's partly in the word choice here. So these are some really interesting choices of word. Commandeer, ammunition, barricade. These are military words, obviously. Ammunition is an interesting word choice. As far as I know, there were no shots fired. This isn't literal ammunition. There were Molotov cocktails hurled. So that's an interesting word choice. It's a very deliberate, striking word choice. Commandeer is particularly interesting. What does commandeer mean? When you commandeer a vehicle, you take the vehicle that didn't belong to you. So from the perspective of the person who has it parked out front or who is driving in it, it might feel quite a lot like theft, hijacking. But it's a legitimate thing to do. It's legal. It falls under the rules of war. So it's a very telling word choice. And what's happening in this stanza? Well, the overwhelming sense is one of coordination, organization. So I think this is where the sense of kind of revelry and chaos meets what I mentioned earlier, which is a note of caution, a note of skepticism. Let's celebrate. Let's remember that the events themselves were exhilarating, but let's not downplay what I, a somewhat marginal figure, can remind you of, maybe more kind of powerfully or strikingly than you yourselves will be able to as you revel in your stories. Let me remind you that you succeeded, partly succeeded, because of your organization and solidarity and planning. You ran a really tight operation. You sent out scouts, and then you formed, and this is an extremely interesting word. So the equivalent would be posse, and I think posse is brilliantly poised between two senses. So a posse can be, a group of trusted friends and associates. A posse can also definitely have a criminal connotation. But a posse can also have specifically the connotation of law enforcement, a group of people assembled specifically for the purposes of enforcing law. So balanced between criminality on the one hand and law and justice on the other, which I think is the perfect word in this context. And then I think the poem, I'm not sure. I actually think it's quite ambiguous, and I'd be interested to hear what you think about how it's ending. So we know that there's a kind of success here. There's a celebration of the success, and the enemy has kind of run away, and they're going to plan counteraction. And again, here the voice is kind of ambiguous, and I think it's deliberately ambiguous who's speaking. Certainly, it's the poet who's chosen to end in this way, but there's again a kind of deniability here. Arguably, it could still be the rebels that are speaking. It could be the rebels who are saying, well, now they're going and they're planning their counteraction. They're going to bring plastic bullets and they're going to bring water cannons next time. It's not clear whether the poet is saying, here's something somebody told me, kind of borrowing their legitimacy, their lived experience, or if they've maybe kind of slipped in their own view, their own judgment, a little bit of editorializing. And then we end with Scarman, Lord Scarman, who headed up the official inquiry. And I think that's a significant way of ending. I'm not quite sure what the poem means by framing Scarman in this kind of dismissive way. I think we could probably have a few theories. Scarman's report, which I think would have been out by now, by the time this was written. Certainly would have been in process, but I think, or at least in process, but I think would have been published and would have been read. Its recommendations were in some ways not as bad as you might expect. Scarman, addressed kind of broader social and economic inequalities, was critical of police tactics, and made recommendations, for example, about community consultation. On the other hand, really stopped short of recognizing the kind of institutional racism amongst the police, and ultimately was an expression of the establishment, and the more progressive recommendations of the report were essentially just rejected, swept to one side as we moved into the 1980s and Thatcherism and kind of rise of hard neoliberalism. So, what do we make of that line, asking the audience to disregard Scarman? I'm not quite sure. Possibly, one reasonably strong interpretation is that Scarman is the kind of the good cop, the somewhat softer, more conciliatory aspect of the systems of oppression and subjugation here. But there's another side to it, which is plastic bullets and water cannons, and Scarman's recommendations for policing by consent, for better communication and consultation between the communities of Brixton and elsewhere and the police force are don't be distracted, don't be misled. There's another war coming, or there's another battle, part of the same war coming. I think that's probably quite a good reading. And I think that Scarman is a significant presence at the end of this poem, because I think that the poet Linton Kwesi Johnson is kind of positioning himself as a counterpoint to Scarman and his report. And that's ultimately what this poem is doing. It's in a much more kind of concise way is analyzing events, making judgment as to their causes and their wider implications, and making recommendations. And it's a different kind of knowledge base, and so it's a different set of recommendations. And essentially what it is to stay sharp, stay alert, remember that these events, whilst they were chaotic and haphazard in many respects, were also very well organized in other respects. And that's a very difficult thing to say. So we should remember something about riots, which is that they frighten powerful people, because they disrupt the status quo. And powerful people shape the language and the concepts that are available to think about things for all of us, for everybody. That's ideology, that's discourse. So we should anticipate that the language and the concepts and the habits that we have for thinking about something like a riot are infused with the fear of the felt by the powerful, infused with the kind of interests and agendas of the powerful. And how does that manifest? Well, I think one of the ways in which it manifests is to make the legitimacy of any riot kind of impossible. So I think looking back on the Brixton riots, when they were used, for example, about 10 years ago in 2011, as a lens on events that were happening then, the Brixton riots, with the benefit of time, have become more acceptable to establishment voices. They've kind of entered into British history, and there's not quite so there's more of a willingness to acknowledge them as a kind of legitimate expression of political struggle in the face of injustice. But at the time, certainly they weren't. And one of the ways in which these events, and which riots in general, are kind of delegitimized, is by putting them in this double bind, this very difficult situation where they're kind of, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. And I've suggested that the way in which riots are presented, and the Brixton riots were presented, in order for them to be legitimate expressions of political will, they need to be spontaneous. Because if they're not spontaneous, it's said that they've been planned by some particular group, perhaps some kind of malign outside influence, and they then get called phony, artificial, staged, a conspiracy. And then on the other hand, in order to serve as a legitimate expression of political will, according to their standard presentation, riots are asked to have specific goals, ideally goals expressed as explicit demands, but at the very least goals that are kind of somehow expressed in the conduct of the riot itself, in what does and does not happen in the riot, in what rioters do and do not do. So these two things that are kind of demanded of riots in order that they be considered legitimate expressions of political will, in order that they be considered political acts rather than consigned to a realm of kind of self-interested criminality. These two things that are demanded of riots are contradictory. Riots are asked both to be disorganized, spontaneous, just kind of springing up, just happening, and they are asked to be organized. They have to follow a certain logic, and they have to have a certain set of explicit or implicit demands. And I think that that tension is something that this poem explores, and does more than explore. It kind of negotiates that tension, and it finds itself in that impossible bind, and yet it manages to kind of exist and to speak and to celebrate and to strategize. Okay. Thanks very much. I'm going to leave it there.
Man, we'll bring a blam blam. It was in April 1981.